She would smile at you when you came through the door. That was the thing everyone remembered afterward. The ones who came through that door on the Osage Trail in Kansas between 1871 and 1873, and lived to describe it. The travelers who stopped and felt something wrong and left before the meal was finished. The men who looked at that canvas curtain dividing the cabin and felt the specific cold certainty of animal instinct saying, "Get out now and listen to it." Every single one of them remembered the smile. Kate Bender was young, and she was beautiful, and she smiled at travelers the way a person smiles when they are genuinely glad to see you, and she would take your coat, and she would ask about your journey, and she would sit you down at the table and bring you food, and she would make you feel in the specific warm way of someone who is very good at making people feel things, that you had found a safe place on a very long and very lonely road. She would sit you down with your back to the canvas curtain, and then the curtain would move. Nobody who sat with their back to that curtain on the wrong night ever described what happened next, because nobody who sat with their back to that curtain on the wrong night ever left that cabin alive. Tonight, Pale Meridian brings you the true horror of the Bloody Benders, America's first serial killer family. A father, a mother, a son, and a daughter who built a cabin on the Kansas frontier in 1871 and turned it into the most efficient killing operation the American West had ever seen. Who murdered at least 11 people in that cabin in the most specific and methodical way imaginable. Who built an orchard over the bodies of their victims, and who vanished into the American frontier in May of 1873 before the law could reach them, and were never officially caught and never officially tried and never officially executed for a single one of the deaths they left behind them in the black Kansas dirt. This is not a comfortable story. This is not a story with a clean ending or a satisfying resolution or the specific narrative closure that the true crime genre usually provides. This is a story about 4 people who were very good at something terrible and who got away with it and who walked off into the dark of the American frontier and disappeared and whose fate has never been definitively established. This is the story that gave the Kansas Plains nightmares for a generation. This is Pale Meridian, where the frontier ends and the darkness begins. Story 1. The Cabin on the Osage Trail. The cabin was small. 1 room, approximately 16 feet by 20 feet, built from rough-cut lumber on a claim in Labette County, Kansas on the Osage Trail, the road that connected Independence, Kansas to the settlements further west, and that carried a steady traffic of travelers, settlers, cattle drovers, and the specific miscellany of humanity that the American frontier produced in the years after the Civil War, when half the country was moving west, looking for something they had not been able to find in the east. The Benders arrived in Labette County in October 1870. 2 men first, John Bender Sr. and a younger man named John Gebhardt, who was either his son or his son-in-law, depending on which account you believed, and who the family subsequently identified as John Bender Jr. Then, the women, Ma Bender, John Sr.'s wife, a large, raw-boned German woman whose neighbors would later describe her as the most frightening person they had ever encountered in a life that had not been short on frightening people. And Kate. Kate was in her early 20s. She had dark hair and dark eyes and the specific physical presence of someone who understands the effect they have on people and has learned to use it with the precision of a tool. She advertised herself in the local papers as a healer and a medium, a spiritualist who could commune with the dead and cure the sick, and read the futures of people who came to her with their fears and their hopes and their specific frontier vulnerability laid out before her like a map. People came. Of course, people came. The Kansas frontier of 1871 was a place of extraordinary isolation and extraordinary hardship and extraordinary longing for connection and meaning, and the specific comfort of someone who claimed to know things that the ordinary world could not tell you. People came to Kate Bender from miles around and sat across from her at the rough wooden table in that 16 by 20-foot cabin and paid her to tell them what she saw. What Kate Bender saw when she looked at her clients was something she never told any of them. She saw whether they were worth killing. The operation that the Bender family had designed and built in that cabin on the Osage Trail was so specifically engineered for its purpose that the investigators who eventually examined it stood in the empty structure and felt the specific cold recognition of people confronting something that has been thought through with a thoroughness that implies not impulse, but premeditation, not anger, not opportunity seized in a moment. A system built and refined and operated with the specific professional attention of people who had done this before and intended to keep doing it. The canvas curtain divided the cabin down the middle. On the public side, the side the travelers saw when they came through the door, there was the table and the chairs and the warmth of the stove and Kate's smile and the smell of food cooking. On the other side of the curtain was the darkness where one of the Bender men crouched and waited. The trapdoor in the floor behind the curtain opened into a cellar approximately 5 feet deep. The cellar had a drainage channel cut into the dirt floor that ran to the outside of the cabin. The drainage channel had a specific purpose that became clear when the investigators eventually opened the trapdoor and descended into the cellar and found what was on the dirt floor and on the walls and in the drainage channel. The specific purpose of the drainage channel was to carry blood out of the cellar without it pooling and seeping through the floorboards and becoming visible to the next guest. The Benders had thought about the blood. They had planned for it. They had engineered their killing space with the specific attention to detail of people for whom this was not a new problem. The hammer was kept behind the curtain. A heavy geological hammer with a long handle, the kind used for breaking rock in the mining operations that dotted the Kansas territory, that had been specifically selected for the task it was put to in that cabin. The investigators who found it later described the handle as darkened from use in a way that suggested it had been used many times and cleaned many times and used again with the specific regularity of a tool that is maintained because it is relied upon. Here is exactly what happened to the people who sat down at that table with their backs to the canvas curtain on the wrong night. Kate would bring food and conversation and that smile. The meal would proceed, and the traveler would begin to relax in the specific way of someone who has been alone on a long road and has found warmth and company and the illusion of safety. Their back would be to the curtain. Their attention would be on Kate. One of the Bender men, senior or junior, the accounts differ on which one took the primary role, and the answer is probably that they took turns, would position themselves on the other side of the curtain directly behind the seated traveler. They would wait for the specific moment when Kate's eyes told them the traveler was sufficiently relaxed and sufficiently positioned, and then they would drive the hammer through the canvas curtain into the back of the traveler's skull. Not a glancing blow, not an uncertain blow. A single devastating strike delivered with the full force of a large man swinging a heavy hammer at close range into the back of a seated human head. The investigators who examined the remains of the Bender's victims found that the skulls had been struck with such force that the bone had been driven inward in a way that was not consistent with a single blow, but with a blow of extraordinary violence delivered at very close range. The traveler would drop from the chair. If they were not dead immediately, and some of them were not, the human body having a specific and terrible resilience that the Benders had apparently learned to account for in their operation, the trapdoor would be opened and the body dropped into the cellar, and Kate or Ma Bender would descend and cut the traveler's throat with a knife that the investigators found in the cellar along with everything else, and that had been sharpened recently enough that the edge was still keen when they found it. The cutting of the throat was the insurance. The hammer blow was for speed and surprise. The knife was for certainty. The Benders did not leave things to chance. The body would lie in the cellar while the blood drained through the channel to the outside. When the bleeding was done, the body would be carried out through a door at the back of the cellar that opened below ground level and buried in the orchard that the Benders had planted behind the cabin. An orchard that grew with the specific lush vigor of ground that has been regularly amended with something richer than Kansas clay. By the time the investigators found the orchard in May 1873, it contained 11 confirmed bodies. The graves were shallow, 3 feet at most, some closer to 2, because the Benders had been burying bodies in that orchard for 18 months, and the ground was running out of room, and they had apparently decided that depth was less important than coverage. What the investigators found when they opened those graves is something I'm going to describe because I think it deserves to be described, and because the sanitized versions of this story that have been told for 150 years have done a disservice to the people who were in those graves and to the specific reality of what the Benders did to them. The bodies were in various states of decomposition, consistent with having been in the ground for periods ranging from a few weeks to over a year. Several of them had been buried face down. The investigators initially found this puzzling, and then found it less puzzling when they understood the specific reason for it. Bodies buried face down decompose differently than bodies buried face up, and the Benders had apparently discovered through experience that face-down burial reduced the likelihood of surface disturbance as the body settled. They had been doing this long enough to have developed burial preferences based on experience. Every body showed the same injuries: the catastrophic skull fracture at the back of the head consistent with the hammer blow, the cut throat consistent with the knife in the cellar. Every single one, 11 confirmed, the same 2 injuries on every body in that orchard. The hammer and the knife, the hammer and the knife, 11 times in 18 months in a 16 by 20-foot cabin on the Osage Trail. One of the bodies was a child, a little girl of approximately 8 years old, whose name was never definitively established, but who had almost certainly been traveling with her father, a man whose body was found in the same grave, and who the Benders had apparently decided could not be left alive to report what she had seen, even though she was 8 years old, and even though what she had seen was her father being murdered. The child had the same injuries as the adults: the hammer blow to the back of the skull, the cut throat. I want you to sit with that for a moment. An 8-year-old child in a shallow grave in an orchard in Kansas, with a hammer mark on the back of her skull and her throat cut, because the Benders had decided she was a loose end. What do you think that cabin smelled like on the inside after 18 months of that operation? And what do you think Kate Bender's smile looked like to the people who came through that door and never came back out? The orchard held 11 bodies when the investigators opened it in May 1873. The Benders were gone. The cabin was empty. The hammer was still behind the curtain. The knife was still in the cellar. And the drainage channel in the cellar floor was still dark with the residue of what it had been built to carry. But the Benders were gone. And what happened next is the part of this story that the history books have never been able to finish. Story 2. Kate Bender. I want to tell you about Kate specifically, because the story of the Bloody Benders has always been told as a family story. 4 people, 1 operation, collective guilt distributed evenly across 4 names. And I think that telling obscures something important about what Kate Bender actually was and what her specific role in that cabin actually required of her, and what it says about her that she performed that role for 18 months without apparent distress and without a single recorded moment of hesitation or remorse. The men behind the curtain did the physical work of killing. Ma Bender disposed of the bodies and maintained the cellar with the specific domestic thoroughness that the investigators noted when they described the cleanliness of the drainage channel and the organized state of the killing space. John Sr. was the muscle and the presence that discouraged anyone who might have been inclined to cause trouble. But Kate was the mechanism by which the whole operation functioned. Without Kate's specific ability to make strangers feel safe and welcome and sufficiently relaxed that they would sit with their backs to a canvas curtain while eating a meal in a cabin full of people they had never met before, without that specific skill deployed with that specific consistency over 18 months, the whole operation falls apart. Travelers who feel unsafe do not sit down. Travelers who feel unsafe keep their eyes moving and their hands free, and do not let themselves be positioned with their backs to anything they have not examined. Kate kept them from feeling unsafe. She was extraordinarily good at it. The neighbors who knew her described her in terms that are consistent across multiple accounts, and that together paint a specific portrait of someone whose social intelligence was exceptional and whose emotional presentation was completely under conscious control. She was warm when warmth served the purpose. She was charming when charm served the purpose. She was vulnerable when vulnerability, the specific performance of vulnerability that makes people feel protective and therefore less guarded, served the purpose. She advertised her spiritualist services in the local papers, and she performed them convincingly enough that people paid for repeat sessions and recommended her to their friends and traveled significant distances to sit across from her at that table in that cabin. She was not a fraud in the sense of someone going through motions they did not believe in. The accounts of people who attended her seances described something that genuinely disturbed them, a quality in her performance that went beyond theatrical trickery into something they found more difficult to categorize. One account from a man who attended a Kate Bender seance in the winter of 1872 and who survived to describe it describes the specific experience of looking into her eyes during the session and feeling that she was not looking at him but through him, that whatever she was doing when she performed her readings was involving a quality of attention that was more like assessment than perception, that she was not seeing what was in him but calculating what he was worth. He left without finishing the session. He could not explain why. He described feeling as if he had been examined rather than read and found to be insufficiently valuable for further attention. He was right. He was not a traveler passing through alone with money in his saddlebags and no one expecting him at the other end of the road. He was a local man known in the community who would be missed immediately and whose disappearance would generate immediate attention. Kate had assessed him correctly and found him unsuitable and let him go. She was selecting, constantly, carefully, with the specific professional attention of someone running an operation that required raw material of a specific kind. Isolated travelers, strangers to the area, people whose disappearance could be explained by the frontier's ordinary attrition, people who were carrying enough money to justify the risk, and who had no one waiting for them close enough to raise an alarm quickly. She made these assessments with a smile on her face while she brought food to the table and asked about the journey and created the specific warm atmosphere of a safe place on a lonely road. The investigators who studied the Bender case in the months after the family's disappearance came to a specific conclusion about Kate that the official reports recorded with the careful language of men who were not entirely comfortable with what they were saying. They concluded that Kate was not a participant in the family's operation. She was the architect of it. The canvas curtain and the hammer and the trapdoor and the cellar and the drainage channel in the orchard, all of it was built to serve the specific function that Kate performed at the table, with her smile and her food and her ability to make strangers feel safe enough to sit with their backs to something they could not see. Without Kate, there was no operation. The hammer was just a hammer. The curtain was just a curtain. Kate was the thing that made the whole system work, and she knew it, and she had apparently decided sometime before October 1870 that this was the use she was going to make of her specific gifts. She was in her early 20s when she made that decision. She was in her mid-20s when she disappeared into the American frontier with her family and the money they had accumulated from their victims, and was never officially found again. What do you think Kate Bender thought about when she was sitting across the table from a traveler she had already assessed and selected and was waiting for the right moment to give the signal to the man behind the curtain? And what do you think she felt when she heard the hammer strike and the body hit the floor? The mechanism of the Bender operation was the hammer and the knife and the trapdoor and the orchard. The soul of it was Kate. And when the law finally came, looking for the soul of it in May 1873, the soul of it was already gone. Story 3. The Disappearance. William York's brother was a Kansas state senator. This is the specific fact that ended the Bender operation, not the accumulating weight of disappeared travelers, not the specific suspicions of the neighbors who had felt something wrong about that cabin since the Benders arrived, not the investigators who had been piecing together the pattern of disappearances along the Osage Trail for months. A Kansas state senator's brother went missing on the road through Labette County in March 1873, and the Kansas state senator had both the motivation and the political leverage to make the investigation of that disappearance something that could not be quietly set aside the way the previous disappearances had been quietly set aside. Colonel Alexander York rode to Labette County himself. He interviewed the Benders in their cabin on April 4, 1873. He sat at that table across from Kate Bender and asked her about his brother William, who had passed through on the road to Independence and had not arrived. Kate told him she had seen William York. She told him he had stopped at the cabin for a meal and had moved on. She told him he had seemed perfectly well. She offered to use her spiritualist abilities to help the colonel find his brother. She looked at him across the table with those dark eyes, and she smiled. Colonel York left the cabin unsatisfied, but uncertain. He had no evidence. He had only the specific discomfort of a man who has sat across from someone and felt something wrong that he cannot point to or name. He rode away from the cabin and began organizing a more systematic search of the county. He came back 10 days later with a larger party to begin a methodical search of the properties along the Osage Trail. The Benders were gone. The cabin was empty. The stove was cold. The hammer was still behind the curtain. The knife was still in the cellar. The family's personal possessions were largely still in the cabin: clothing, tools, the accumulated material of 2.5 years of living in that space, as if they had left in considerable haste and had taken only what they could carry and had not had time to make the departure look like anything other than a flight. The wagon was gone. The horses were gone. And the Benders were gone into the American frontier on a night that nobody had been watching the cabin, because nobody had yet understood what the cabin was. Colonel York's search party found the orchard 2 days after they found the empty cabin. The first grave they opened contained the body of William York. He had the hammer fracture at the back of his skull, and his throat had been cut so deeply that the investigators who examined him noted that the blade had reached the vertebrae. He had been in the ground for approximately 6 weeks. The things that 6 weeks in a Kansas spring do to a human body in a shallow grave are things I am going to describe because they are part of what was found in that orchard, and because the people who were in those graves deserve to have what was done to them fully recorded rather than sanitized. The decomposition was advanced. The body had bloated and then collapsed in the specific way of bodies that have been in warm ground through the transition from winter to spring. The features were no longer recognizable as the individual they had belonged to. The clothing had preserved the shape of the body better than the body itself. The smell when the grave was opened was something that the investigators' accounts describe with the specific careful restraint of men who were trying to convey something without fully conveying it, something about the specific sweetness of advanced human decomposition combined with the black Kansas soil and the roots of the orchard trees above that had been drawing sustenance from what was below them. They opened 10 more graves, each one the same combination of injuries, the hammer and the knife, and each one in a state of decomposition corresponding to how long they had been in the ground. The most recent burial was approximately 3 weeks old. The oldest was over a year. 18 months of operation in a 16 by 20 foot cabin, 11 confirmed bodies in a small orchard behind it. The child was in the 4th grave they opened, buried with her father, 8 years old by the investigators' estimate. The same injuries on her small body as on every adult in that orchard. The investigators' accounts of finding her are the most restrained passages in an otherwise grimly factual record. The specific, careful language of men who are describing something they are finding difficult to describe professionally and who are using the tools of professional distance to get through the writing of it. I am not going to use professional distance. She was 8 years old, and she was in a shallow grave in an orchard in Kansas with a hammer mark on her skull and her throat cut from ear to ear, and she had been there for what the investigators estimated was approximately 4 months. And what 4 months in Kansas soil does to an 8-year-old child is something I will leave to your imagination, because your imagination will be more accurate than any description I can give, and because she deserves the specific horror of being imagined rather than the specific horror of being described. The search for the Benders began immediately and continued for years and produced conflicting accounts and disputed sightings, and the specific frustrating inconclusiveness of a manhunt for people who had grown up without roots and without fixed identities and who understood better than anyone how to disappear into the vast, dark interior of the American frontier. 2 women were arrested in 1889 in Michigan on suspicion of being Ma Bender and Kate. The trial that followed was inconclusive. The women were released. The question of whether they were or were not the Benders was never definitively answered. Various accounts from the years following the discovery of the orchard claimed that the Benders had been caught by a vigilante posse and killed in the Indian Territory and buried in unmarked graves. These accounts were specific enough in their detail to be plausible and inconsistent enough in their particulars to be unverifiable. The men who allegedly comprised the posse never officially confirmed the story. Some of them denied it. Some of them smiled when asked and said nothing. The official record ends with 4 names on a wanted poster and no confirmed resolution. The Benders killed at least 11 people in a cabin on the Kansas frontier between 1871 and 1873. They built an orchard over the bodies. They disappeared before they could be arrested. And they were never officially caught and never officially tried and never officially hanged for a single one of the deaths they left behind them in the black Kansas dirt. Kate Bender smiled at 11 people and signaled the man behind the curtain and listened to the hammer strike and went on with her day. And then she walked off the edge of the known world with her family and the money in her saddlebags and vanished into the dark of the American frontier. She may have lived for decades after that orchard was opened. She may have kept smiling at people on roads far from Kansas. She may have found other curtains and other hammers and other orchards in other counties in other states where nobody knew the name Bender and nobody knew what that smile meant. Or she may have died in the Indian Territory with a vigilante's bullet in her and been buried in an unmarked grave and rotted back into the same frontier soil she had used to cover her victims. Nobody knows. That is the most frightening thing about this story. Not the hammer, not the knife, not the 11 bodies in the shallow graves and the child with her throat cut in the 4th one. The most frightening thing is that nobody knows what happened to Kate Bender, which means there is no ending to this story. Which means she might have gotten away with it completely. Which means she might have kept doing it. What do you think Kate Bender did for the rest of her life after she walked away from that cabin? And do you think she ever stopped smiling at strangers on lonely roads? This is Pale Meridian, the Bloody Benders. A canvas curtain and a hammer and a trapdoor and an orchard and a smile that made you feel safe on a very long and very lonely road. 11 confirmed bodies in shallow graves, an 8-year-old child with the same injuries as every adult around her, a drainage channel in a cellar floor that had been specifically engineered to carry blood out of a killing space without it pooling and seeping through the floorboards into the room where Kate was smiling at the next traveler. And 4 names on a wanted poster and no confirmed ending, and the specific open wound of a story that history has never been able to close because the people responsible for it walked off the edge of the known world, and the darkness swallowed them the way the darkness swallows everything on the frontier eventually. The Kansas plains held their secret the way they hold everything that happens on them, quietly, completely, without comment. And somewhere out there in the unmarked geography of the American frontier, Kate Bender is either in an unmarked grave or she is not. And the difference between those 2 possibilities is the difference between a story that ended and a story that kept going in ways that nobody was ever in a position to document. Subscribe to Pale Meridian for new frontier horror every single week. Leave a comment telling me which detail of this story is going to keep you awake. And if you have ever stopped at a roadside inn on a lonely road and felt something wrong that you could not name, leave it below. Good night. And do not sit with your back to anything you have not examined.